The check sat on the desk for almost 30 seconds before anyone said a word. Marcus Delacroix had written the number himself, in his own hand, and he'd written it large enough that there could be no ambiguity about what he was offering. Not a token of gratitude, not a polite gesture, but a genuine, life-altering sum of money. The kind of number that could pay off a mortgage or fund a decade of a doctor's research without a second thought. He was 46 years old, the founder and majority owner of a logistics empire that spanned 11 countries. A man who had learned, over 2 decades of closing deals, that almost everything in the world had a price if you were willing to name a large enough one. He slid the check across the desk toward Dr. Elena Busquets. She didn't pick it up. 3 days earlier, Marcus's 6-year-old daughter, Josephine, had been rushed into emergency surgery for a rare and aggressive form of pediatric cardiac arrhythmia, the kind of diagnosis that specialists discuss in hushed, careful language, the kind that comes with survival statistics nobody wants to say out loud in front of the parent. Dr. Vasquez had been the surgeon on call. She had performed a procedure that, according to the 2 other specialists Marcus had frantically consulted before the operation, carried perhaps a 40% chance of full success. Josephine had come out of surgery breathing steadily, her small chest rising and falling in the specific, unremarkable rhythm that Marcus would later describe as the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. Dr. Vasquez, Marcus said, in the same tone he used when a deal was nearly closed and only needed one final gesture of goodwill to complete it. I don't think you understand what you did for my family. This isn't a payment. It's not meant to be transactional. I simply want you to know what this is worth to me. I understand exactly what it's worth to you, Elena said, and there was nothing cold in her voice, only a kind of quiet, settled firmness that Marcus, in all his years of negotiation, had rarely encountered from someone declining money. That's precisely why I'm not taking it. Marcus, unused to being told no by anyone in a room where he was the one holding the checkbook, pushed the check another inch closer. Consider it a donation to your research fund. Then, anonymous, if you'd prefer. I don't need my name on anything. I just need you to take it. I heard you the first time, Elena said, and finally looked up from Josephine's chart, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he'd walked into her office. The answer is still no. However, neither Marcus nor anyone on his considerable staff had any idea, walking into that hospital 3 days earlier, that the reason behind Dr. Vasquez's refusal had nothing to do with hospital policy, nothing to do with modesty, and everything to do with a loss she had carried for 11 years that she had never once discussed with a patient's family until this particular refusal made silence impossible. Elena Vasquez had been one of the most pediatric cardiac surgeons on the East Coast for the better part of a decade, the kind of specialist whose name got passed between worried parents in hushed, hopeful recommendations. What almost none of them knew, because she had built an entire professional identity around not needing them to know it, was that 11 years earlier, she had lost her own daughter, Mia, to the exact condition that had put Josephine Delacroix on her operating table 3 days ago. Mia had been 5. The surgery, at the time, had been considered experimental, offered by a surgeon Elena had trusted completely, performed at a hospital with excellent outcomes and enormous resources. It hadn't been enough. Elena had sat exactly where Marcus had sat 3 days ago, holding a hand that had gone still, in a hospital that had done everything medically possible and had still, somehow, not been enough. She had gone back to medical school 18 months later, not despite what had happened, but specifically because of it, retraining in pediatric cardiac surgery with an intensity that colleagues sometimes described, not always kindly, as obsessive. She had told herself, in the years since, that every surgery she performed was, in some private and unspoken way, the one she hadn't been able to save. I'm going to tell you something I don't usually tell families, Elena said, setting down the chart, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. And I need you to understand it's not a story I'm telling for sympathy. It's the reason that check is going back to you. Marcus went still in a way that had nothing to do with negotiation tactics and everything to do with something in her voice he hadn't heard from her before. 11 years ago, Elena continued, I had a daughter named Mia. She had the same condition Josephine has. I sat in a room exactly like the one you sat in 3 days ago. And the surgery that was supposed to save her didn't. Marcus's hand, still resting near the check on the desk, went completely motionless. I don't do this work for money, Elena said. I have more of it than I need. Frankly, the hospital pays well, and I don't spend much. I do this work because every single surgery is, in some way, I've never fully explained to anyone, an attempt to finish something I wasn't able to finish for my own daughter. If I take your check, it becomes a transaction. And the moment it becomes a transaction, it stops being what it actually is for me. Which is what? Marcus asked quietly. A second chance, Elena said. One I don't get to have for myself, but I get to give it to someone else's family. And that has to stay separate from anything that looks like payment. Or I think, eventually, it would stop meaning what it means. Marcus sat with that for a long moment, the check still lying untouched on the desk between them, and understood, for the first time since he'd walked into her office with a solution he'd been certain would work, that he had misunderstood entirely what kind of transaction he was even trying to make. He didn't push the check forward again. What Marcus did instead, over the following months, was something considerably harder for a man used to solving problems with a single large check, written in one sitting. He asked Alina carefully what would actually help, not her, since she'd made her position on that unmistakably clear, but the specific gap she'd identified over a decade of practice. The lack of funded research positions for surgeons willing to specialize in exactly the rare condition that had taken both MIA and nearly taken Josephine. Alina didn't take a cent of it personally, but she spent the better part of a year helping Marcus's foundation structure a research fellowship, fully funded, named not for Marcus or for Josephine, but for Mia Vasquez, a name that had never before appeared on anything public in the 11 years since her death. I asked her once why she'd allow that, Marcus said later, retelling the story to his own board of directors during a foundation announcement. When she wouldn't allow a single dollar directed at her personally, she told me it wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about making sure the next family in that waiting room had one more resource than she'd had for Mia. Josephine Delacroix is 7 years old now, healthy, unaware of most of what happened in that hospital except in the vague, comforting way that young children remember frightening things that turned out fine. Marcus still visits Elena's practice twice a year, not as a donor exactly, though the fellowship continues, fully funded, indefinitely, but simply to sit in her office for 20 minutes and update her on how his daughter is doing. Because Alina, it turned out, had asked for exactly one thing in place of the money he'd originally offered. Just tell me she's still doing well, she'd said. That's the only payment I actually want. If you believe that the most meaningful gifts are sometimes the ones that can never be bought, and that grief can be transformed into something that saves other people's families. Please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that some things are worth more than any check could ever cover.